Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for being here, especially on a Friday morning, towards, for me at least, the end of the semester, though I know that it is busy in public libraries around this time as well. Thankfully, taxes are over, right? So that's one big thing down. But yes, I had this beautiful introduction by everyone. And so right now I'm going to share my screen so that I can start the presentation. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, I'm going to present. Oh, aha, there we go. And so I hopefully can make this full screen. Okay, great. So today I'll be talking about how to be a better manager, how to recognize, accept, and adjust your biases in the workplace. So the process is hopefully easy, right? We'll start off with an intro, a little bit more about me, then we'll move on to what is EDI, and finally, how do you combine that with management? So again, hello, everyone. My name is Fobazi Ettarh. Here are some of the places that you can find me. Please feel free to follow my Twitter. That's probably the fastest way to find me, quite honestly. If you would like to read some of my more long form things, my website, again, fobaziettarh.com. And finally, if there's nothing good with, nothing bad about the classics, you can always email me if you want to reach out and ask any questions. It is finals for me right now, so it might take some time for me to get back to you, but either way, I always try and get back to everyone who reaches out to me. And a second, because that is bothering me. So I'm just going to do it that way. Okay. Zoom share. Is it not sharing anymore? Someone let me know if you can.
We see the Twitter page.
Okay, so I'll stop it for a second and hopefully restart. Okay.
There it is.
Okay, great. Oh, technology. Even when you think it works, it decides not to. Okay, so before we begin, I'd like to mention that, this may cause some discomfort, and that is totally normal. I would ask you to embrace it, in fact, especially when it comes to things like deconstructing vocational awe and talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion. These are topics that can be combined with a sense of self, a sense of identity. And so when we're all learning, it can seem very personal. And I want to say that again, that's a very normal reaction, a normal thing to feel. However, I would ask if we could try and embrace the discomfort, right? There's a reason they call it growing pains. Growth is not the most comfortable thing. It is usually an awkward, uncomfortable feeling, right? But the actions that come from growth are what make us better as people, as employers, as managers and supervisors. And so again, while those feelings of defensiveness and discomfort might be valid, try your best to try and figure out how to turn that into action. Okay, so again, I am a librarian, I am a scholar, I'm an activist, and most importantly for you all, I'm an equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility consultant. So what does that mean, right? As a EDIA consultant, my job is to help organizations build more holistic and inclusive workplace cultures. My job is to using an equity-driven approach that is rooted in critical race theory, feminist methodologies, universal design, and the deconstruction of vocational awe to look at organizations, look at institutions, and see where are the places that we can begin to acknowledge what needs growth, right? Where we can move forward and be better as both employees, as supervisors, as managers, and as an organization. And so how I can help today, right, is that sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger than someone in-house. All of you are from different organizations, and so that is also one way that it's easier, right, to have one person talk to a bunch of organizations than to have, you know, one person go to each organization time after time after time, right? And my job is to break down these big and sometimes messy topics like equity, diversity, and inclusion into more manageable steps. And finally, you know, what we all hope that can happen from this event is that when everyone can bring their true selves to work, knowing that their opinions matter and their voices are heard, communication and overall productivity will improve. And so, what is EDI? So, we'll start off with diversity. Diversity is the presence of difference within a given setting, usually between people within an organization. So with difference, right, this means the facets of identity that make us the very cultural melting pot that America is, right? The different racial cultures, ethnicities, sexualities, gender identities, religions, so on and so forth. And so equity, right, is an approach that ensures that everyone has access to the same opportunities. Equity recognizes that advantages and barriers exist depending on whom you are, and that as a result, we don't all start from the same place. One of my sort of favorite sayings when it comes to equity isn't pie, right? There is no such thing as having not enough, right? It's not a pie that can be taken away. If I have equity, that doesn't take away your equity, right? And so it just acknowledges the fact that in our society, in our institutions, depending on whom you are and what institutions and what values we privilege, some people may start off with disadvantages and some people may not. And finally, inclusion is about folks with different identities feeling and or being valued, being leveraged, and most importantly, being welcomed within a given setting or workplace. Another saying, right, is diversity is having all types of people at a dance, but inclusion is actually inviting them onto the dance floor. You know, it's not enough to just have many diverse peoples within a room, within an organization, if they are kept to the sidelines or if they are stopped from reaching a certain organizational level. And so hopefully, right, that's where, again, the equity comes in, understanding that not everyone has the same opportunities, but making sure that knowing that we can still make everyone feel welcome and valued. And vocational awe. Vocational awe, for those who might not know, describes the set of ideas, values, and assumptions librarians have about themselves and the profession that result in notions that libraries as institutions are inherently good and sacred and therefore beyond critique. And so what does this mean? Let's break it down a little bit more. Libraries are inherently good. After all, they provide access to all, have diverse collections, champion truth and free speech, unless they're undesirable. Libraries have a long history of, through policy and culture, showing that undesirable populations aren't in fact welcome in the library. Whether it was the history of segregation within libraries, in which many public libraries closed rather than integrate, or used the Carnegie money that they received in order to integrate to create separate and less funded reading rooms specifically for African Americans, and then made sure that the times were incongruous to the majority white population. What we're seeing now, right, are things like this starting to happen again. We're having states, legislators trying to defund libraries when they try and stand their ground in terms of making sure that LGBTQ users can access books. Again, right, the instinct is to shut down, to close the library, rather than to allow queer people to access the library. It could be other policies that show that people aren't welcome. Things like having a government ID in order to get a library card marginalizes those who may not have, maybe experiencing homelessness or are otherwise transient. Libraries are inherently sacred, often seen as wholly otherworldly, awe-inspiring spaces, a safe space or a sanctuary. But again, a sanctuary for whom? A safe space for whom? Only for the privileged, only for those we deem worthy. And we show whom we deem worthy, again, through policy. When we say that outside groups can use our meeting rooms and don't discriminate against hate groups using said meeting rooms in the library, what we say is that only those who either agree with the hate group's ideology or can hide and pass as someone that the hate group wouldn't want to exterminate, only those people are allowed and welcome in the library, right? Because if a library is welcome to Nazis, then it becomes a Nazi library and not a library for all. If a library becomes welcome to TERFs or trans exclusionary radical feminists, then it becomes a TERF library and not a library for all. Because again, I couldn't walk into a library where Nazis were welcome and be safe, right? Even if for some reason I might share the same ideologies as them, right? They would not see me as someone worthy of personhood. And so by my very being, I am not welcome. Libraries are beyond critique. Libraries are often called the last bastions of democracy, the soul of the community. But if libraries uphold white supremacy and ignore more valid critiques like labor issues with overwork and underpay, can it truly be considered a democratic institution? No democratic institution would suppress or ignore or censor people within their community in order to continue to have a squeaky clean image. No truly democratic institution is beyond critique, is beyond reproach. You need all of the voices to make it a democratic institution, to make it what we as librarians hope our libraries to be. And again, when I say all voices, this does not mean that we allow Nazis and hate groups and other bigots into the library. That is a false equivalency, because again, the only people who are safe when hate groups and bigots are allowed into a space are other bigots or those who can pretend to have personhood to said bigots. And so why did I spend, a half hour basically defining all of these key terms, all of these topics? Well, I think it's important for all of us to be able to work off the same page and definition because it reduces confusion. It makes sure that we all are working off the same set of rules, as it were. It also helps with assisting in understanding the framework that I'm coming from and connects with any questions or data that I may or may not end up collecting through our conversations, right? And again, I think most importantly, that regardless of rank, status, place on the organizational chart, etc., understanding EDI and breaking down vocational awe benefits everyone by making a healthier and more holistic workplace. And so, how do we become equitable managers? Before I go to the next slide, I'm actually going to have you all in the chat do some work, not don't want it to be just me talking for an hour and a half, right? And so what my question is, and you can start to put these answers in the chat, is think about the groups that you have been in. Think about either, it doesn't have to be a work group, it could be, your church choir, it could be your baseball team, it could be whatever kind of group or team, or it could be work, if that is what best comes to your mind. But for the next 5 minutes, I want everyone to write, what are the things that make a good team? Like, what a good group? What are some of the ways that like, okay, this is a group I want to stay in. This is a team I want to be on. This is a workplace I want to continue in. It could be something as simple as that it has good teamwork. Whatever it is, think about it and start to share that in the chat now. I'll put the question. Oh, they already did. Thank you, Jen, for I'm seeing some great answers in the chat. All right, now take these next minute or so and read through the other responses in the chat. And feel free to, put thumbs up or hearts next to those that you also agree with. And if you want to keep putting things in the chat, you also may.
Can I have a moment of vulnerability here? How do you do reaction like in the chat? Like, do you have to double click it or something? Does anybody want to share that?
Yeah, so if you either hover your mouse over what they said, a little speaker bubble will pop up and also a little smiley face. And so when you scroll over the smiley face, it will show either a heart or a laughing emoji or a thumbs up, or there's various different.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes, no worries. We're all here to learn. So knowing that, I'll give everyone another minute or two to, now that we all know how to react, to read through all of the answers in the chat, right? Because again, as I said in the beginning, right, I want us all to try and be, if not on the same page, at least in the same book, right? When it comes to figuring out together what makes a good team. All right, so I'm seeing a lot of great answers. And so definitely two that I would like to call out. Ooh, I definitely switched it. I forgot to switch this to good team, my bad. Right? But what makes a good team, right? Trust, the ability to come to a supervisor or manager, or really just any of your coworkers, right? And tell them things and know that their voice will not only be supported, but advocated for, right? I know that a lot of us in the chat mentioned things like this, right? Good communication, openness, right? And also clarity, understanding where exactly to go, whom to go to, right? In order to get the support needed to fulfill job duties or whatever the duties might be, right? And so, again, looking at the chat, some of the other things that we have come up with as a group, right? We have a lot of people saying communication, right? Which is super important, right? And it goes right with trust, right? We need to be able to know that when we talk to other people in our organization, when we talk to our supervisors and our managers, that we can actually have a good conversation, have good communication with them, right? And know that they will support us in whatever it is we might need, right? Even if it's just verbal support, right? We know we work in libraries, it might not always be financial support that we're able to get, but just knowing that there's respect for one another, that everyone is working towards the same goal, right? We have people saying the ability to contribute, openness, and willingness to change, right? All of this goes towards clarity and trust, right? Knowing who is actually supportive, knowing who's willing to change, knowing that as an organization, there is a common goal, a destination that we're all hoping to get to, even if we have different ways of getting there, of showing it, knowing that regardless of that, we can trust each other to have that shared vision. We can trust each other to push back when, things might not be going in the right direction, right? And knowing that, again, it's not out of any sort of maliciousness, but idea of making everything clearer, making everything just more equitable as we move towards everything, right? One of the major metaphors that is used when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion is that of a race. We all are trying to get to the finish line, but some of us may have more barriers in front of us than others. And so we need a good team, right? A healthy and holistic team, group, institution is able to understand that barriers are in place in front of certain people, certain initiatives, and come together to figure out, if this is our shared goal, how do we make sure everyone can get there in, if not the same amount of time, at least a similar enough amount of time. And as Megan says, right, this comes with an investment of time to come to common understandings, right? It again comes to that trust, to know that I can come with my issues and say, I need help. Or say, this seems to be more difficult than perhaps it is for others. How can we make it more equitable for everyone, right? So that, again, that clarity, understanding exactly what is considered success, how we get there, and who, if any, people we need with us in order to get there. And so now, as my slide accidentally spoiled, right? Let's talk about what makes a bad team. That might be perhaps easier to remember, right? Think about all of the different groups or teams or workplaces that you've been in, and what are some of those issues that just made it not so great? So again, I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to write that down, put it in the chat. Yes, I'm seeing some great answers in the chat. And again, just like before, feel free to look at some of the things that other people are saying, and feel free to co-sign or like whatever they're saying. All right, so I'm seeing some great answers in the chat, and here are two that I want to point out, right? Opacity is definitely one that I'm seeing a lot in terms of other people's answers, right? Just not knowing what is considered success or failure, not having an idea of who or where to go for help, for support, not knowing what the common goal is, or if there is in fact a common goal, right? Just not knowing in general can be very hard to do what you need to do, right? If you don't know what success is, how do you know if your job, what you're doing in your job is considered successful, right? If you don't know what or whom to go to for help, how do you know if you're failing or not, right? And toxic positivity is one that is, I would say, endemic when it comes to libraries, right? The belief that no matter how dire or difficult the situation is, that people should maintain a positive mindset. You know, I'm not saying, of course, that we should all be cynics, right? And that we should have a pessimistic mindset, but to know that the sky is falling, right? But saying that is seen as more negative than the actual sky falling, right? That's what toxic positivity is. It's the refusal to acknowledge that things are in fact dire, that things do need to be helped. And so I'm seeing other great things, right? When people don't speak up. And that is another thing that toxic positivity can lead to, right? If you know that no matter how bad it gets, that you will be forced to look on the bright side, it doesn't really encourage one to speak up, right? It doesn't encourage trust or working together, because it's disregarding and minimizing the negative things that are happening. Seeing other great examples of, in terms of like, yes, being risk averse, having people talk over you, groupthink. These are all, again, very important ways that cause a workplace to just not be good, right? To not be great, to know that maybe this isn't the place that I can continue my career, right? Or to set roots. Other things, being self-serving, having defensiveness when questions are asked. Yes, again, that idea that the questions are somehow more offensive than the situation itself, right? Like, or I see Jean has a great thing, when the team is gathered to rubber stamp something instead of build something. Exactly. As an institution, if we're not willing to have everyone help, right? If it's just one person at the top, usually saying this is what we're doing and not allowing any other voices, then again, like, why are we here, right? If certain voices are dominating the conversation, then it erodes that trust that I mentioned in the last slide, right? It erodes that transparency. And so, right, now that we know, now that we as a group have come together to basically define what a good organization looks like versus what a bad organization looks like, let's talk about microaggressions, right? So microaggressions are a comment or action that subtly and often unconsciously, right? It's important that we know it's usually unconsciously or unintentionally expresses a prejudiced attitude toward a member of a marginalized group, right? Such as a racial minority, but microaggressions can be against sexuality, gender identity, disability, any marginalization in that way has its own microaggressions. And so I could, take the next 20 minutes and define all the different types of microaggressions. But again, I find it easier to have you all as a group do an activity that better helps you understand it. And so Jen had mentioned in my intro that I did a game about microaggressions, and I think that is going to be the more sort of visceral way to get this across. And so I'm going to put the link in the chat. So it should look like this when you get there. So there are approximately 30 people in our presentation. So I'm going to say that if you are in the first 15, you are going to play as Alex. And if you are in the last 15, you're going to play as Leslie. And so take basically the next 10 minutes to play through the game. So again, it will give you the various things to click on. And as you continue to play, you'll notice that some options are no longer available to you, depending on how you react to the microaggressions that you experience. So I'll give everyone those 10 minutes. If you finish early, please feel free to start playing as the other character. Good question. So I think that the chat is divided by alphabetical order, by last name, or at least that's what it looks like to me. So how about if your last name is A to L, you do Alex. And if your last name is M to Z, you do Leslie. So I'll put that in the chat again. If your last name starts with A to L, you shall be Alex. If your last name is M to V, you shall be Leslie. We'll give everyone about another 2, maybe 3 minutes. Again, if you've already finished, feel free to start playing through the other character, and we'll share out again in about 2 to 3 minutes. All right, it's just about 15 after, so I think let's take these last 15-ish minutes to share out what, for those who played Alex, what were some of the experiences you had? What were were you able to be promoted at the end or not? Or did you, what were some of the experiences, those who played as Alex? You can put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself, whichever you'd like. Okay. Krista, you said that you ended up having to find another job. And so how did it feel, Krista or Jennifer, to go through the game and not be able to get promoted? Yeah, I can imagine.
I'm gonna unmute just to say I tried to play it, making decisions the way I would personally, even though Alex had very different identities than I do. So it was almost a little disappointing too, to know that I was kind of playing it too safe.
Yeah, yeah. And Katie, yes. Can you, if you'd like, talk a little bit more about what you wrote? You said, I got promoted, but the idea of having to change the culture was tiring. Yes, yes, that sort of slow knowledge that what you do is literally changing your options as you go forward. Mhm. And what about those who played as Leslie? What were some of your experiences? Same question. Did you end up promoted? Did you end up finding another job? What did it feel like reading some of those situations that you found yourself in? Yeah. All of the situations in the game were things that either I or my friends have experienced personally. So these are all real situations that happen to people of color, to queer people, to disabled people. For the professional situations, what did it feel like knowing that, like, depending on if you spoke up or didn't, the ways that the coworkers would treat you would change? Did it feel like the coworkers meant to be saying or doing the things that they were doing? Right. Again, if we go back to the sort of definition of microaggression, right, it's usually either unconsciously or unintentionally. And yet, as we are seeing from your chats, right, that it feels tiring, right? It feels like, as Susan said, like so it feels like it must be on purpose sometimes, right? Because how could people be so clueless? Mhm. Yeah. And so, it's important to know that, right, that to the people experiencing the microaggression, it often does feel like, as you guys are saying, right, either like weaponized incompetence, like how could people really be so ignorant, like, and yet if you were to ask the coworkers, right, that they would probably not see themselves as being problematic in any way, right? It was just jokes, or like they were just curious, or right, these are sort of common reactions to microaggressions when they happen in real life. I know people are mentioning the hair, especially with Leslie, that is something that constantly Black women or other women of color, but especially Black women, tend to have to educate people about, again, whether it's like people touching their hair or people making weird comments about it. It could be definitely hard not to feel frustrated. Yes, Susan, exactly. I think that we think of microaggressions as like a one-time thing, right? Just one person saying one thing at one time. But as you notice in the game, right, that it's usually never one thing. Another sort of metaphor for microaggressions are like sort of the tale of 1,000 cuts, right? Maybe you don't notice the first 10 or 15 or 100 even, but by the time we're hitting like 600, 700, 800, right? That's when it's like really starting to hurt, and maybe you have less patience or less grace for those who are doing the things, right? And what's important to know is that regardless of which path you take, is always going to be a tiring path, right? If you decide to speak up every single time, right, that's obviously labor that you're doing every single time, making sure you're educating people about you. And it might lead to you professional consequences. But if you do the other side and you sort of let it go the whole time, you might end up continuing up through the ranks, but the same fatigue will still be there. And so in these last couple of minutes that we have, what are some of the questions that you have, either about the game or about anything that we talked about, or just in general about some of the things we touched on?
We did have a few questions or scenarios given ahead of time, but I'm happy to give a moment if somebody had something come up before we go to that, if that's okay.
Mhm.
Well, maybe while people are thinking and typing, I could read a question that was submitted. So one of the ones that was submitted says, how do I manage microaggressions between coworkers as a bystander? I don't want to out or other anyone, but I also don't want to stand by in a situation where someone may need help.
Yes. So I think it depends on, context, as we saw from the game, right? Like, it's hard to know exactly what to do in every situation. But I would say that it's, even if there are two ways to go, right? You could sort of say something like, whoa, that's not cool, or like, like yikes, or like, something that demonstrates that what was said was problematic, and so that the person saying it knows that you are not going to stand for offensive things that are said, even if it is, again, something where perhaps they didn't know. And that also gives the person who's being microaggressed the knowledge to know that you are an ally there, right? So even if they don't say anything in that moment, they now know that you are a person that they can go to when other microaggressions happen to them. If that is perhaps too confrontational for you, you could talk to the person who was microaggressed later on to say, hey, what happened to you before wasn't cool. I just want you to know that, I'm here for you. And if you want to take this a step further with either them or HR or whatever, that I'm here for you. So again, that's another, I think the most important thing is letting the person who got microaggressed know that, one, it was wrong, and two, that you noticed it was wrong and are an ally for them. I think in general, making an environment where microaggressions aren't stood for at all is important, especially if you are the bystander, because you're not the one sort of suffering, right, 1,000 cuts, as it were. And so that would be my suggestion. I'm sure in these cases, right, either Alex or Leslie it might have been different if they had more coworkers who would have stood up for them, right? So that they wouldn't have to be the ones always making the choice to confront a person or to back down, right? If everyone is deciding together, hey, we don't stand for this, then the burden isn't put solely on the people who are suffering the microaggressions.
Right. Yeah, that would be great advice. I think there's a lot of times where in the workplace too, people are in that where like they want to do something or they want to say something. It's just trying to be sensitive to the, person who's kind of the target of it. Do we have time for one more question? I know we're right at 11:30.
Yeah.
Okay, because there was another one in here that I thought was pretty good too. What about bias during the interview process? So how can we address the American concept of professionalism when it comes to behaviors in an interview?
Yeah, I think that, again, just learning about different cultures can be helpful here, right? Because professionalism is very much based on a sort of upper middle class WASP culture, right? And so understanding and doing the reading of things like white supremacy culture can be really helpful to figuring out, like, okay, when we're saying things like collegiality, and when we're saying things like professionalism, what exactly are we defining as that, right? Sort of like, I always try and model what I say, right? Sort of like how we all as a group defined what makes a good or a bad team. As a group, having that discussion, what defines professionalism? What defines collegiality? And making sure that when you're having those discussions, that you're talking to not just managers and supervisors, right? But staff or students, or, you know, as many different people as possible, so that we know if this is the organization that we're trying to get to, right? A more diverse, a more holistic one, that we aren't accidentally gatekeeping away some of those people by our standards of what professionalism looks like or what it feels like.
Excellent. Thank you for that so much. And I think this is a good spot to stop our recording. So would one of my co-hosts be interested in doing the recording stop?